When I was about 10 years old, this is in Oklahoma City, the church where my dad was the preacher, we had these old, ratty blue songbooks in the pews in front of us, because this is back in ancient times when we sat in pews and we sang out of songbooks. Okay, they were songs of the church, right? These blue hymnals. Any of you remember the old songs of the church? Any of you remember singing out of songbooks? Okay, some of you are there. All right, and these were old books. We talked for years about replacing the books, but we didn't have the money in the budget for it. And then one Sunday we showed up and there were brand new gold songbooks in all of the pews. And my dad, who's the preacher, announced that morning that because of the generosity of one of our members decided we needed new books, didn't have the budget for it, so he went out and bought new songbooks for the entire church. And I remember asking Dad after service that morning, I said, well, Dad, who was it? Who bought the songbooks for us? And he wouldn't tell me because the giver wanted to remain anonymous. Another time, a few years later, we were at a different church, also in a different part of Oklahoma City. And one Sunday, this is back in the days when we had the old boards up at the front of the church that had all the numbers. You remember those? Remember the number boards that had like how many people were in attendance, how many people were in Bible class, how many people were in Wednesday night, which we never should have put that Wednesday night up there, but that's a whole nother thing. We also had how much the budget was and how much our giving was every Sunday. And we were under budget for the year, and the weekly budget at that time was something like $6,000. I don't remember what it was. But one Sunday we came in, and the budget said that the last week's contribution was $16,000. It was about $10,000 more than our average contribution. And I asked Dad about that later, and he said, again, one of the members at the church noticed that we were about $10,000 behind our budget for the year. And so one member decided to get the church caught up with a check that one week. Again, I asked my dad, well, who was it? Again, he wouldn't tell me because the giver wanted to remain anonymous. Okay, side note, but I think this is important. I just told you two stories, the first of which happened over 25 years ago, the second of which happened over 20 years ago, and I still remember both of them vividly because the lessons we learn as kids come much more from what the adults in our lives model than they do what the adults in our lives say, right? That generosity from those two people that I have no idea who they were made a huge impact on my life because I saw that as a kid. If we want to teach our children the lessons of Jesus, the best way to do that is to model them, not just to tell them. That work? All right. Those adults, long ago, taught me through their actions principles about giving that come straight from the Sermon on the Mount. If you have a Bible in front of you, go ahead and turn it to Matthew chapter 6. We're in the middle of a sermon series on the teachings of Jesus here in the Sermon on the Mount. And this is a section where Jesus tells us what does it look like for us to live as kingdom people. If we are called to be followers of Jesus, what does that mean? How are we supposed to live our lives? And Jesus has several things to say. In our section this morning, he teaches us about giving. Notice Matthew 6, starting in verse 1. He says, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So, when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you." All right, two specific words out of this passage that I want to define. I'm going to put them up here on the screen in Greek. And typically when preachers put words on the screen in Greek, that is solely for the purpose of making us look good. So I want to warn you, this is supposed to make me look good, so please notice as I do this. If I don't tell you, you won't give me proper credit. All right. Two words we need to define out of this. The first one is this word diakosune, which means covenant righteousness. Here in verse 1, Jesus says, when you practice your righteousness, okay, and that's that word, dikaiosune. Everyone say that, dikaiosune. Very good. All right. It means covenant righteousness. All right, the entire story of the Bible is about how God has created a covenant with us. Right? We remember from reading even back in the book of Exodus how God redeemed us out of slavery. He took us out of captivity, made us his own people. And part of the process of him making us belong to him is he created this covenant relationship with us. Okay, so when we practice our righteousness, this is not about somehow earning our salvation or doing good deeds to make God love us. This is us living out our side of the covenant. Okay, in other words, God says, I've made you my people. Now here are the things that you're supposed to do to act like my people. Okay, in other words, if we are children of God, we're supposed to act like children of God. Okay, it's the practice of our righteousness. Okay, and this is the same way it works in your marriage, right? When you get married, like I did to my wife, we got married 15 years ago. We took vows to each other. We entered into this relationship to each other. And so we don't treat each other well because we're trying to earn anything. We treat each other well because of the relationship that we already have, right? Okay, it's the same thing in our relationship with God. In a healthy relationship, we try to live out that relationship. So, here in chapter 6, Jesus is going to talk about 3 different acts of covenant righteousness. Okay, 3 ways that we are supposed to live in response to God's covenant. It says, when you give, when you pray, and when you fast. Right? Jesus is assuming that we are doing these 3 things. And there are other things that he could have listed here, right? He could have said, when you go sacrifice, or when you study the scriptures, or when you do lots of things that we do as part of practicing our righteousness. But Jesus chooses these 3 things, and he tells us the same thing with all 3 of them, both when you give, when you pray, and when you fast. Okay, and his main lesson with all of these is that what God really cares about is your motivation. It's your heart. Okay, what heart do you bring with you when you give, when you pray, when you fast, when you practice your righteousness? Okay, you could do these things for lots of wrong reasons, but God cares about you doing it for the right reasons. If you practice your righteousness to draw closer to God, then you're finally living like Jesus. All right, so that's the first word. Second word, hypocritai. Everyone say hypocritai. Okay, that is the Greek word from which we get literally the word hypocrite, okay, or actors, okay, or in our world we might call them politicians, right? You know, in the Greek world, an actor, a hypocrite, was someone who literally wore a mask. The way it worked in Greek theater, which was one of the most popular forms of entertainment throughout the ancient world, the characters would wear masks so that you would know what emotion they were supposed to be displaying. So they would change masks throughout a play. And when a character was feeling really excited, they'd wear an excited mask. If they're feeling angry, they'd wear an angry mask, right? And so the word hypocrite became known for someone who's acting in a different way than they really are. It's an actor. So Jesus says, when you give, don't what? Don't be an actor. Don't put on a mask. The mask that you show the world should reflect what's really going on inside of you. So, Jesus says that when he looked around him and saw the Pharisees and the teachers of the law giving, they weren't doing it to reflect who they really were. They were doing it as hypocrites. They were playing a part. They were pretending. Okay, this is one of the deepest burns in Scripture. Okay, when Jesus says this about the Pharisees, they would have felt it. They would have gotten angry immediately. You don't call people this. This is provocative. All right, so I really only have one point today. If you're taking notes on your bulletin, I left you a nice big blank. You can write this. If you want to take a nap, you can do it after you hear this one thing. All right? When you give, don't be a hypocrite. When you give, don't be like the Pharisees. Don't be like the teachers of the law in Jesus' day. Don't pretend. When you give, don't be a hypocrite. What is the number one way that Christians can turn people off to Christianity today? That's not a trick question, right? Okay, by being a hypocrite. When we pretend to be righteous and holy, when we pretend that we're better than other people, when we put on this mask that says, oh, everything's great and wonderful in my life, and in reality what we're doing is putting on a show. Okay, if you want people to quit church faster than they're quitting landlines, show them that Christianity is nothing more than play acting, that it doesn't really matter. Now, part of the reason that this is a bigger deal today than it even would have been in generations past is I believe that we are more sensitive now to fake things than people ever have been before. Okay, I think the world that we live in, the culture that we live in, has taught us to see everything around us as fake. Okay, we've had the internet for a long time now, and what we learned really quickly when the internet came out is that you can't trust everything you read on the internet. If you see someone's profile picture somewhere, you have no idea if that's what they really look like. When you get an email telling you that you have millions of dollars somewhere, if only you'll fork over the small price of a couple $100s, you know it's not real. Okay, we are the most advertised to generation that's ever existed in the history of the world, too. And what happens is we see thousands of advertisements every year all around us, and we know that most of it is pure deception. If you buy this, you'll feel this. If you get this from us, then this will happen in your life. And we have learned how to look through all of that and know that none of it's real. We can smell fake from a mile away. And when you grow up in a world like we do, where everything is fake, we are desperate for something real, and we should be able to find that in church. And yet, if we come to church and we can't be real, people will leave every time. Okay, if we can't be genuine about who we are here, we should just go ahead and close the building, sell the property, and get rid of it because we're done. Okay? We can't be hypocrites. We have to be real. If we're going to follow Jesus, we have to be real. All right. So this text assumes that we as kingdom people give. And so what I want to do is spend the next few minutes looking at several different reasons why we give. And hopefully as we go through these, we can think about how can we as people mature more in how we give? How do we make sure that we're giving not like the hypocrites, but instead giving from a pure heart? All right, several reasons we give. The first reason we give is we give to be seen by people. And this is the first thing Jesus is talking about. One of the reasons we give is to be seen by people. John Ortberg, pretty famous guy, he facetiously said this. I thought this was a good quote. He said, "I know I'm supposed to be humble, but what if no one notices?" I thought that was good. You know, my two boys are at an age right now where they want me to come and watch everything. Any of you with little kids remember those days? Right, everything they do, Dad, you got to come see this. Dad, you got to come look at this. Okay, Sam the other day figured out that he could stand in the bathtub and straddle the whole bathtub. Dad, you got to come see this. It's impressive. Luke, my other son, he just learned how to snap. Go ask him after church to snap for you. And man, when he learned how to snap, Dad, you got to come see this. It's impressive. I recognize that both of my sons constantly need me to tell them, yes, I see. And I'm hoping that as they grow, they will become more mature and they will outgrow the need for me to see and give approval for every single thing that they do. That make sense? If you are still stuck in the need for people to see what you do and constantly give you affirmation, then that is an indication of both your insecurity and your immaturity. When Jesus is looking at the Pharisees and the teachers of the law and the way that they give, he is calling them out for their immaturity and their insecurity. Apparently in Jesus' day, they thrived on people constantly giving them verbal affirmation for how amazingly spiritual mature they were. Right? I can't imagine literally blowing a trumpet as I'm about to give to somebody. But I don't think Jesus is exaggerating. I think that's actually what they were doing. And Jesus says that has nothing to do with the kingdom of God at all. If you are giving to be seen by other people, you will get a reward, but it's not the reward that you're hoping for, right? When I was in college at Oklahoma Christian, I remember one day we had a chapel service, and they invited a guest to come into chapel that day, and they put him up on stage, and they announced to all of us as the student body that this particular gentleman had given a cool $1 million in cash to the school, and that they were renaming one of the buildings on campus after him. And I remember we all stood up and applauded and said, "Isn't that great that this guy in his wonderful generosity is giving the school $1 million?" And I remember at the time, I couldn't help but wonder if they quit naming buildings on college campuses after donors, would the giving patterns change? If you knew, hey, I'm going to give these millions of dollars, but nothing's going to be named after me, would that change how much money was given? I also wondered about the last guy's name who was on that building, right? And if he ever thought, you know what, someday someone else is going to give a bunch of money, they're going to rename this building after that guy. Now, I don't know that gentleman's heart, the guy that gave the $1 million. I certainly can't judge him. Odds are he is a much nicer person than I am. I know that's a pretty low bar. Okay, I'm not judging that guy, but it does make me uncomfortable, right? You know, fortunately, most of us don't have to worry about our names being attached to a $1 million building. Okay? Any of you given $1 million? Never mind, I don't want to know. Okay, that's not likely going to be most of our stories. But I wonder how our giving would change if everything became completely anonymous. Even think about how you tip somebody at a restaurant. If the waiter or the waitress didn't know it was you that was giving the money, would that change how you tipped? Some of you have gift giving as one of your love languages. You're familiar with Chapman wrote the book, The 5 Love Languages. We all have different ways we like to show love to people. Any of you familiar with that? 4 of you have heard of that before. Okay. Some of y'all need to get out more. Okay, one of the primary ways that couples show love to people, or that people just show love to others in general, is through gift giving. Some of you strike really high in the gift giving category. And my question is if the person didn't know you were the one giving the gift, would that change how you give the gifts? If gift giving suddenly became anonymous and you didn't get any credit for it, would that change how you give gifts? Okay, when you give Christmas presents here in a few weeks, would it change if it didn't change the way the person looked at you, right? If you didn't get credit for it, would that change how you give the gift? You know, again, I'm not likely to ever have my name on a building at a college campus. I'm never likely going to be giving millions of dollars away. But I do remember, even when I was a kid, I used to get a dime every week from my parents. We got $1 every week as an allowance, and a dime of that had to go to church. And I remember hitting that dime in the plate as hard as I could because I wanted it to clink, right? Now, why did I do that? Because I knew all of the adults around me could see that I was giving money, and that was such a big boy thing to do. And I wanted them after church to give me those accolades and those pats on the back and say, man, I saw you giving today, and wasn't that great? I recognize now as an adult that that's very immature behavior, and I'm hoping that we've all grown out of it, right? One reason we might give is to be seen by people, and Jesus says that's not a good reason. All right, second reason that we might give is that we give to get. Okay, we give to get. The Jewish thought in Jesus' day commonly associated acts of righteousness with earning God's favor. And the idea was that the more acts of righteousness you did, the more prayers you said, the more scriptures you read, the more money you gave, then the more pleased God would be with you. And that life was really more about doing good things more than doing bad things. And there was this cosmic checklist, and that God made sure that you had more acts of righteousness on the good side than you had sins on the bad side. And if your good deeds outweighed your bad deeds, then you got to go to heaven. All right. Now, one of the texts from the intertestamental period is the book of Tobit. And here's one of the lines from that book. It says, "It is better to give alms than to lay up gold, for almsgiving saves from death and purges away every sin." Okay, and the belief literally was that if you gave money to the poor, that would cover a certain number of the sins that you had committed. And so therefore, it is easier for a rich person to go to heaven than for a poor person. Now, you think about how many times Jesus has to address that exact issue. Right? Jesus will flip it on its head and say, actually, it's easier for the poor person to go to heaven. And that rocked everybody's world because that's not the way they thought the world worked. Jesus says if you give to get, you might get some accolades. You might get people that stand up and applaud, but it's not doing anything to wash away your sins. If you're giving with the intent of getting, you're not living a kingdom life. I remember one time, this is whenever I was preaching in Texas, and there was this older gentleman at the church who wanted us to do something, and we didn't want to do it. And so I was explaining to him in my office why we were not going to do the thing that he wanted us to do. And he said to me, he says, "Well, David, I give a lot of money to this church. Therefore, Okay, and I quit listening when he said therefore, because whatever he said after that is completely irrelevant, right? We don't give to get. If we're giving so that we can have more influence over people or so that we can get something that we want, we're not following the heart of Jesus. Is that fair? All right. Another reason that we might give is we give as a discipline. Okay, we give as a discipline. If I'm being honest with you, usually whenever I am putting money in the collection plate here or anywhere else I've been, whenever I am giving, I don't think about it in anything other than this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Okay, I was raised in a pew. I was raised with that $1 a week allowance where I was told that a dime out of that's always going into the plate. I was taught from my earliest days that this is who we are and this is what we do. And I didn't know any other way to live because the way I was raised is you give money every week to God. Okay? Usually, when I am giving, I am doing it not with any thoughts of anything other than this is what I'm supposed to do. Okay? Now, I don't think that's wrong. I think it's kind of like, when people exercise, I don't know what that's like, right? But when people get on a regular exercise regimen, they do it as a discipline, right? They run every day whether they feel like it or not. Or they go ride their bike every day whether they feel like it or not, or whatever it might be. And they're doing it not because they want to or not because their heart's in a good place or anything else. They're doing it just as a discipline, right? Now, I would rather you give and pray and fast and do all of these things as a discipline than not do them. And yet I think Jesus is hinting at a deeper way. I think what Jesus really wants us to do is to give out of a transformed heart that longs for God. I think this is what maturity looks like. When we give, are we doing it because we have a transformed heart that truly longs for the kingdom of God? Do we give with pure motives? Yesterday at my house, we put up all of our Christmas decorations. Any of you gone down that path yet? You've done that? If you're righteous, you do it after Thanksgiving. If you need some counsel, you do it before Thanksgiving. Never mind. Okay. Anyway, back when I was in Texas, a family there gave us a little nativity set. And I've never really thought that much about it. I'm a good Church of Christ boy. We never thought about nativity sets. Okay, but Sam saw this nativity set and he said, "Dad, we've got to put that up." And I thought, okay, why do you want to put that up, Sam? And he made sure he put up that nativity set. He said, "Dad, because it's the story of Jesus." And he wanted to see it. And he wanted to tell me the story of Jesus. Okay? And it made me think about how Jesus also says in another place that unless our hearts become like little kids, we can't ever enter the kingdom of heaven. Okay, Sam wasn't doing this just because it's pretty or just because he wanted to do it. He's doing it because in his heart, he's thinking, man, this is the story of Jesus. And I think there's something about that strikes me about how we're supposed to give. Are we doing it with almost the heart of a child that doesn't have room for all the impurities that we add on later in life? But rather, do we give just because we have a heart that longs for God? Okay, I hope we can continue to develop that kind of maturity. The kind of maturity that gets beyond giving based on what I can get out of it, or even giving as a discipline, but rather gives because we long for the things of God. All right, we will continue this series next week as we look at prayer and as we think more about the story of Jesus and what does it look like for us to walk in the way of Jesus. But at this time in our service, we are going to sing a few verses of an invitation song. During the singing of this song, I will be down front. One of our shepherds will be down front. This is a time in our service where we as the church want to be here for you. We would love to talk with you or pray with you about anything that is going on in your life. We would especially love to talk with you if you don't know what it means to follow in the way of Jesus. We would love to explain to you more fully what it looks like to put on Christ. Before we sing that song, though, I would like to close us with a word of blessing. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you. May the Lord be gracious to you and give you peace. Let's stand and sing.